Did you know Starfield actually had been in the making for more than 25 years? Yeah, in the late 90s, Bethesda wanted to make a space combat simulator and war game hybrid for MS-DOS called The 10th Planet. It would have leaned more into focusing on battles and strategy rather than exploration, but it would have been a big and ambitious game for the time, and probably would have been one of the best looking games on PC at that point. Even more so, this project was in collaboration with another studio known as Centropolis, which was known for their work on Independence Day cinematics. So with the goal of combining a cinematic narrative with this ambitious concept by Bethesda, this game looked really promising and was described as Star Fox meets X-Wing. There's still a little bit we even know about the setting here. The game would have been set in the Earth's solar system, and the player would have been a private mercenary group in a battle with attacking aliens. Now, what's interesting is that the planets would have actually slowly been moving around the sun like they do in real life, and you would have to switch up your strategy according to that. Also, on the few screenshots we do have, you can see that you would be able to fly close to planets and kind of see what they looked like, though you wouldn't have been able to actually land on them. Now, the articles about the game that were published kind of shows what this would have looked like. And of course, obviously, it's currently speculated that some of the ideas from this game all the way back in the mid-90s would make their way into Starfield. One thing is definitely clear though, this studio has been wanting to make a space RPG for a very long time. But the space games don't stop here. What if we had a game that was like Fallout New Vegas, but this time in space? Yeah, it seemed like later on, after the success of games like Fallout 3 and Oblivion, Bethesda still wanted to make that jump into the sci-fi space realm, and it looks like there was another game in development known as Backspace, which would have used the studio Obsidian, who worked on Fallout New Vegas, and then would have been published by Bethesda and would have maybe used the same engine as the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. This is another canceled project that was supposed to be a sci-fi Skyrim with time travel, and would have been led by Jason Fader, who also worked on Fallout New Vegas. The game was never officially announced, and the only reason we even know about it is because in 2013, Jason Schreier published an investigative article on this mysterious game's existence. Here's how Obsidian themselves described this project in their own design documents. Backspace is a single-player action RPG set in a sci-fi space environment with simple elements of time travel. The combat is paced similarly to Skyrim, but slightly faster since there is no concept of blocking. The easiest way to look at it is a mix of Mass Effect, Borderlands, and System Shock 2 for gameplay and setting. That actually sounds really interesting, and then players would have apparently played as a cyborg that's 90% human and 10% machine, and you would have been actually fighting in this alien invasion 10 years in the future while time traveling back and forth between that and the present, and there would also have been like puzzles, quests, stat points, perks, and all the good old Bethesda RPG stuff we're used to. Apparently, you would also be able to level up your robot arm with different abilities, like a full cloaking function, which could have hinted at some stealth mechanics also being in the game, and also there would have been different types of gadgets you could use, like decoy robots or frag mines. Now, the inspiration for this individual project actually came from Jason Fader himself, and he even went on to say that he worked on concepting it way back in 2010 in his free time with Bethesda as the publisher in mind, and actually drew inspiration for the story from a game he made in 2007 called Thread Space Hyperbole. Now, of course, this game doesn't necessarily have as many ties to Starfield, for example, as Obsidian Entertainment was never owned by Bethesda per se, they were just contracted. But nonetheless, we know that Bethesda had always wanted to do this space sci-fi game, so maybe that's why this game made it a little bit further than just the initial idea phase. But there were other problems because Obsidian wasn't ever just a full studio under Bethesda, they were only contracted, specifically when Fallout New Vegas would release. For instance, there was some controversy around the time of Fallout New Vegas's release because the contract stated they would only receive this pretty substantial bonus for the game if a Metacritic score would result in an 85 or above. Fallout New Vegas ended up only getting an 84%, and that 1 point ended up resorting in the studio having financial difficulties and having to lay off part of the team in 2011 with shifting focus on other games that they were contracted for. This probably resulted in some bad blood there, and nonetheless, it seemed like this space game that could have released through Bethesda just fell apart. But it would have been interesting to see a different space game using a Bethesda engine like the Skyrim one. Fallout 76 might be the newest game in the Fallout series, but there are actually plans for an online Fallout game that date all the way back to 2006. Way back then, Interplay, the creator of Fallout, actually started working on a Fallout MMO called Project V13, which would have been set in the Fallout world. This project actually came with some concept art that would be released later on, but you can actually see a post-apocalyptic Seattle with locations like an airplane graveyard, swamps, old factories, deserted cities, snow areas. It looks like a lot of thought was already put into all of these locations early on. And if we know from later Fallout games, Seattle or New Seattle is a location that still exists in the Fallout world. There's also art of enemies like mutant shrimp, ghouls, other survivors that you probably would have encountered across all the different locations in some way or another, and some of the early art was actually shown on a teaser website that had you sitting at a desk with a television and dim lighting, and you had the ability to look at Polaroids that would tease this game. Obviously, since this is a video about canceled games, as cool as this concept is and the art looks, we never actually saw this game released. But the idea for a Fallout MMO had obviously been floating around at Interplay for years at that point. It's not quite clear what year this idea first formed in, but there are sources that state that back when studio founder Brian Frago was still the head of the studio, these ideas were maybe being circulated around, and he would later depart in 2002. So the first Fallout Online ideas may have been developed way before that date. While we don't know much about the details and ideas specifically about this first Fallout Online, we do know that Black Isle Studios was approached as a potential developer for the project since they had also developed Fallout 2. Black Isle Studios founder Fergus Urquhart turned down the project though, citing time and money constraints that would make it challenging to get this project off of the ground and then to keep it running. After that fell apart, Microforte, the developer of Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel, would be considered next, but that project also ended up getting canceled. So after all of that, this canceled project was still not fully dead, and Interplay started taking things into its own hands in 2006 with Project V13, also known as FOOL or Fallout Online. Also, that same year, there would be a filing submitted to the SEC to attract investors and get the game funded. When doing this, they submitted this PowerPoint presentation to get, funders interested, and holy heck, they used Comic Sans for all of the titles. Comic Sans, guys! Okay, maybe that's besides the point, but this was the first time we learned what the exact ideas for this MMO were, and these are all quotes from that SEC presentation. The Fallout MMOG will be developed in the highly recognized Fallout post-nuclear apocalyptic world, giving consumers an ongoing virtual experience of today's life as if the Cold War, which lasted for the best part of the second half of last century, had led to a nuclear disaster. The Fallout MMOG is a subscription-based online game, and the market is global as players can access servers from any country subject to localization. Consumers are purchasing or downloading a client application which connects to a world server and allows access if the subscription fees are current. Consumers will pay recurring subscription fee or purchase usage-based time cards to log into the game. Then they go on to talk about how the competition would be games like World of Warcraft, Lineage, Guild Wars, Mu Online, and a few others. They even pointed out that part of Interplay's management was previously involved in World of Warcraft, which, mind you, at this time was like at peak popularity or getting close to that peak popularity. It's also important to understand that Interplay as a studio had a lot of financial and structural issues beginning in the early 2000s, and the studio was kind of looking for a new direction, almost as a last resort. This might have been the reason that Interplay ended up choosing to sell the Fallout IP in 2007 to Bethesda for almost $6 million USD, with an agreement that they would still develop Fallout Online. This gets interesting because this was a deal that they had made at the beginning of Bethesda's ownership of the Fallout IP, but it also came with the requirement to secure $30 million in funding within 24 months of the agreement and then launch the game within 4 years of 2007, plus a 12% fee of all sales and subscriptions would go to Bethesda. So this was a big turning point and actually kind of initiated development to kick into high gear. It all started really when Jason Anderson, who was the former lead artist on Fallout 1, was hired as creative director for this MMO, but after 2007, there wasn't much news about the game. Nothing was announced or even mentioned until in 2009, Interplay announced that they intended to work alongside Masthead Studios to complete the project, and then finally, the game would officially be announced as Fallout Online in 2010. But then, while it seemed like getting help from another studio might have been a good idea, it actually created a bunch of legal issues for Bethesda, who saw this as a breach of agreement, and it seemed like Bethesda didn't feel like development was moving along as agreed, and the funding goal hadn't been reached yet. While this didn't technically stop development overall, a court battle would ensue, and the courts ruled that Interplay would be allowed to continue to work in late 2009, and this court case would go on until 2012 when they finally settled out of court, and Bethesda would pick up the full rights to Fallout MMO for $2 million and then most likely just vault the idea altogether. It seems mostly like Bethesda just wanted to clean their hands from this online project that was seemingly going nowhere and was willing just to pay out and be done with it. That would have been the end of that story, right? But then in an unexpected twist, just a couple of years later, in late 2012, there was an attempt by Black Isle Studios to revive Project V13 without the use of the Fallout intellectual property. And they went the Kickstarter route, but people were cautious of it because it wasn't very transparent with what they were going to do with the money, and if the money would go straight to development or if it was going to go just to the studio to keep it alive. Nonetheless, that seemed like the end of this Fallout MMO project, and the first time we would see Fallout in any type of online capacity would be with the release of Fallout 76 years later. While Fallout Online is interesting, there were more canceled Fallout games before the Bethesda purchase as well. Fallout Extreme was a canceled squad-based first and third-person action game that was in the concept stages all the way back in the late 90s and was finally canceled in 2000. The game would have taken place 100 years after the Great War in the Pacific Northwest and focused on a revolution against the Brotherhood of Steel, who had taken large territories, though the game would have taken you to Russia and China, which is kind of crazy. Gameplay would have consisted of controlling a 4-person squad and being able to control each member and picking up new members along the way. Choices would have consequences, and also a multiplayer campaign was planned as well. The game was set to release on Xbox and PS2, but obviously this plan never happened and this project fell apart. Another canceled game was Fallout Tactics 2, which would have been a sequel to the first Fallout Tactics game for PC. Not too much is actually known about this, being set in the Midwest and continuing the Barnaky ending from the first game. There's also these 2 pieces of concept art, and they just show like 2 lizard creatures, so there's really not too much to make out of that, and this project was canceled in 2001. Okay, then there was another sequel to Fallout Brotherhood of Steel 2, and this game was actually already in development before the first game even released. And interestingly enough, there isn't concept art, but these pictures are from like an idea board or a mood board or something showing what the vibe of the game would have been like, this time being set in Texas. This was canceled in 2004 when Interplay had to go back and lay off most of its staff back during that time. But then, there's one more big canceled game that would influence the Fallout games as we know them today, and that game was simply codenamed Van Buren. This takes us all the way back to the Interplay days, but was originally planned as the full-on Fallout 3 that we never actually had. And already back then, this game wasn't being planned as a simple sequel to Fallout 2. It would have been quite a bit different and would have been set in Colorado, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. Black Isle Studios was developing this game, and it's the first Fallout game that was fully canceled that we actually have some gameplay footage of besides just concept art, as this game did make it pretty far into the prototype stages. There's a tech demo leaked that showed what this game would have played like, and from the looks of it, it looks like it would have played much like Fallout 1 and 2, but would have had 3D models instead of the 2D models we were used to at the time. Meaning this would be the first Fallout game that would have all these 3D elements in play here. Now obviously ideas from this game would have actually been incorporated incorporated slightly into the real Fallout 3 that we saw in release, and a few more ideas would make it into Fallout New Vegas as well. Now, let's just make things more confusing here because game development is confusing, but Van Buren, this project we're talking about here, is actually the second attempt at Fallout 3 by Black Isle Studios, as the first attempt from a little while earlier would actually fall through because of money issues that Interplay had at the time, and they would go on to create Icewind Dale instead with a part of the work that they had done up until then, but at some point Fallout 3's development would be restarted, and that's when Project Van Buren was actually born. As this game got further in development, it seemed like there were even rumors floating around that there would be a Fallout 4 planned for sometime later on, so it seemed like this development was pretty far along if teams were already internally eyeballing what the future would look like. Nonetheless though, this project got scrapped as well. That's where a lot of the canceled Fallout games end for what we know of so far, but Bethesda themselves actually had a few more canned projects over the years. Like, let's talk about Prey 2 for a second. Now, if you saw a reboot video from a few weeks ago, you already know that the Prey we got in 2017 has nothing to do with the original Prey or Prey 2 that was announced in 2006, and all the original ideas for this original Prey 2 game that was a sequel to the original game were scrapped, and they just took the Prey IP and put it on this new game in 2017. But after the release of the original Prey from the mid-2000s, development on a sequel started in August of 2006, and the game wasn't actually publicly canceled all the way until 2014, but there were a lot of issues getting development started early on, and this IP was also moved around between different companies in 2009, which most likely caused issues and uncertainty as well. Information is very vague with the progress that Prey 2 had back in the 2000s, so it's hard to piece together how far things were along, but after this IP would be moved to ZeniMax and Bethesda in 2009, it seemed like development actually started to take some shape, and ideas for this game being more of an open world-like game started to be formed. Now, of course, this was already a different direction than what the original studio had envisioned for a Prey 2 game, but at this point, at the very least, Prey 2 would have still been directly tied to the first game and followed a US Marshal that crashed onto an alien ship during Prey 1. The game would have started off during the events of the first game, but then would have skipped 7 years ahead to the point where the main character is a bounty hunter on an alien world. This is where he runs into the main character from the first game, and then they team up and he slowly recovers his memory. Kind of a neat idea. Now, while the public wouldn't actually know that the game was canceled until 2014, this project actually ended up getting canceled back in 2011, just nothing was ever made announcement-wise or shared publicly about the topic of this game. There was also some conflicting statements from Bethesda around that time, originally saying that the game was delayed to 2012, so it was a pretty confusing and uncertain time for this mysterious Prey 2 project, as it looked like a game that was easily falling into development hell. So what happened with this game? It seems like this project mostly fell apart because of time issues and Bethesda wanting the developer, Human Head, to add massive features even late in development or without much notice, and ultimately, perhaps the two companies didn't see eye to eye in what was possible or capable for this game. From what we can tell, it seemed like the development studio really struggled working with Bethesda during this time and had to do things like secretly work on other games like BioShock Infinite and Defiance just to finance the development that they were working on with Prey 2. It just didn't seem like a good collaboration, and sadly, this project likely fell apart because of it. Still, it's sad to this day that the original Prey never got a true sequel, as the game had a unique vibe to it, and Prey 2017 was still a pretty good game, but had nothing to do with the original Prey, and fans still wish they could see that original universe explored one more time. Okay, now let's talk about Oblivion for the PlayStation Portable. You all remember the days where games would get random spin-offs closely based on a main series release, but on the PSP? It happened with games like Call of Duty, and well, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion almost got such a game developed by a studio known as Climax Studio, who were working on a Silent Hill PlayStation Portable game as well at this time. Now, what's interesting is the Oblivion PSP game was in development at the same time as Oblivion originally was, and Climax Studios actually got early access to builds of the main version of the game to make sure that the PSP version captures that same charm. Now, it seems like development was already rocky somewhat from the beginning. It seemed like things started out on an in-game engine, but later were switched over to renderware, and the game itself obviously would have been a more linear experience than the main release of Oblivion because of hardware limitations with the PSP. But there are leaked builds and footage online, and what we can see is that things actually got pretty far in development compared to some of the other games in here. Even more interestingly, there were a lot of locations that would have maybe depended on what quest you were on that would then load the location in, and they would be unlocked based on your progression, but still there was a lot of locations that were supposed to be in the PlayStation Portable version of the game. Now, the use of staggering the location accessibility was probably in order to maximize the power of the PSP without overwhelming the game's performance. And when it comes to the story side of things, what we do know is that it would have been set in Tamriel during the events of Oblivion, but in a different part of the continent. This game would have served more as like a second storyline or a sister game that stood alongside the main game rather than a retelling of the main Oblivion story, but it would have played into the Oblivion Crisis conflict as well, and some characters from Oblivion would have gotten extra backstories, and there were more than apparently 180 quests that were planned in comparison to the main Oblivion game that had roughly 210 quests. Now, while this project seems like it was pretty cool, even the footage we've been showing looks like a pretty awesome experience, but apparently this game had a lot of issues with the engine, and also, as with many of these projects, there just wasn't enough money funding behind the game to warrant this game getting the tender loving care that it actually needed. By the time things were switching engines, it was already too late for the project to be finished in a timely manner, and ultimately the game would be scrapped and canceled. Ever hear of the game Skip Barber Racing? Yeah, the Barber Pro Series was a real-life racing championship game from 1986 to 2003, hosted by the Skip Barber Racing School that trains professional race drivers. Now, in the 90s, Bethesda was supposed to develop a game called Skip Barber Racing, but for unknown reasons, this project ended up falling through. So nowadays, it's kind of interesting to think that Bethesda at some point was involved in a sports racing game, but early on, they had a history of making some sports games like hockey, bowling, and other racing games, so it's probably why they were approached for this project, but the Bethesda we know now probably wouldn't do something in that field like they would maybe consider in the mid-90s. In 2012, the parent studio ZeniMax for Bethesda founded a studio known as Battlecry Studios with the goal of creating a studio with experience in microtransactions and free-to-play games. In 2014, they announced their first game called Battlecry and immediately showed off some gameplay. This game was inspired by MOBA gameplay and would have been a third-person free-to-play game, and in 2015, there was even an open beta, and the game did look kind of okay and maybe kind of fun, maybe a little rough around the edges, but it looked like a decent starting platform for what could be a free-to-play game that would slowly evolve over time. Things didn't go too well afterwards, though. In 2015, the studio was needed to help modify and restructure the Bethesda creation engine. They had to work in conjunction with the sister company id Software to get the engine up to speed with multiplayer functionality ready for Fallout 76. Ultimately, ZeniMax needed to reallocate how their resources were set up across their studios, and this meant a total stop on development for Battlecry, and by 2017 it seemed like this game was pretty clearly abandoned and canceled. There's another title on Bethesda's list of canceled games known as Commander Keen. This one's interesting. It would have been a nice side-scrolling game back in the early 90s to early 2000s, but eventually kind of fell off and never got any new titles. So it was interesting and exciting when a new game in this series was announced in 2019 at E3 and was a mobile game. People weren't too excited about mobile games getting these big announcements, especially a mobile game that was revisiting a beloved franchise from the 90s and 2000s. After the backlash, it seemed like Bethesda just kind of ghosted the idea of this game, and there was no mention of this game pretty much publicly ever again. It's been 4 years, and it's assumed that this mobile game has just been likely canceled. And then this is just like a bonus one, but Star Trek RPG. Apparently, all the way back in 2010, during an interview, Todd Howard himself revealed that they once pitched a Star Trek RPG that would have played similarly to the Fallout 3 that we know and love today. All we know about the existence of this project is that during a podcast, Todd Howard started talking about it, and we would love to know more about what happened to this prototype pitch or whatever that they tried to send off that never happened, because a Star Trek RPG could have been very interesting. But that is it for our video today. What did you guys think of these canceled games? Is there one that you really wish you got to play and experience? Let us know in the comments down below. Make sure you subscribe and notifications on for more videos like this. Huge shout out to our patrons for supporting our channel along the way. If you want to throw a couple dollars our way, you get your name in the credits and access to other things like Discord perks and whatnot. So maybe consider looking our way. That's it for today. We'll see you guys next time with a new video.